We are anticipating triple digits tomorrow and Wednesday, and ERCOT is forecasting enough supply for the increased demands. Doug Lewin, energy expert and author of Texas Energy Power Newsletter, joins us now to discuss this further. And so, what are you seeing, Doug?
Yeah, just as you described it, Jenny, I think there will be enough power is what it looks like for now, based on the current forecast. But yes, a forecast of 84,000 megawatts in the middle of May would be hard to overstate how extraordinary that is. Our all-time record for May is 77,000. So that is obviously, almost a 10% increase on the previous May record. And the all-time record ever in the worst heat wave we've ever had, well, August 2023, 2011 was slightly worse, but among the worst heat waves we've ever had, August 2023, we were at 85,500. So to be looking at numbers like 84,000 is pretty extraordinary. Now, usually ERCOT will over forecast. They are pretty conservative. They usually pick the higher in their range of forecasts. So it's typically, I usually take the under, right? I think we'll probably come in a little below 84,000 somewhere, but still, that is an extraordinary amount of demand. We just today hit a new solar record. First time solar has ever produced more than 27,000 megawatts. So even with that 84,000 number, we're looking at somewhere around 25 or 30% of demand at peak will be produced by solar power. And that is a big part of the reason why we will likely not have conservation calls, much less energy emergencies.
Okay, this week. That's right. And let's clarify something. You mentioned the August 2023 record. Was there not one set last August 2024?
So there was like a little bit of like an accounting issue on that. Like it involves how they count charging of batteries or something along those lines. And it looks like, I think if you look at, I could be wrong about this, but if you look at ERCOT's official records, I believe August 2023 is the all-time peak, and August 2024 was slightly below that. It was still north of 85,000, but not quite as high as 2023.
Gotcha, because I've seen both. All right. So, Doug, you've been tracking several bills that you've dubbed anti-energy. Let's go one of them. So, Senate Bill 715 recently passed, I think last week, requires all renewable energies to buy back power mainly from coal and gas plants. That sounds like a good idea. What's wrong with that?
Well, yeah, there's a lot wrong with it. I think the most important thing here, Jenny, is that when you look at any grid, okay, it operates as a system. You don't require every single generating unit to procure its own backups. That would be incredibly inefficient and expensive. So let me give you an example. The biggest problem on a grid that a grid operator worries about and has to prepare for is the largest generating unit they have potentially tripping offline. Because if the largest generator trips offline, you end up with the supply demand imbalance and frequency can go bad. And then you can have cascading problems on the grid. Well, the biggest generating resource we have are nuclear plants. They're 1,250 megawatts. Do we make nuclear power plants purchase their own backup reserves? No, we do it as a system. Just last week, a 570 megawatt power plant tripped offline. Frequency dropped. This happened last week. Our fast frequency reserves and all of that kicked in, stabilized frequency. Should we go back to that power plant and say, you need to procure your own reserves? No, because these things happen and you have backup reserves as a system there as backup. That is the way it's supposed to be. Now, here's the other really important piece of this. There was a deal negotiated 2 years ago. Firming is in law right now, but they did it prospectively to give the market time to adjust for people who make big, investment decisions involving millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, even billions of dollars, right? And not just the renewable energy developers, but all those purchasers, right? Walmart, Dow Chemical, HEB, Google, like they're making big purchasing decisions. They need certainty. They need runway that is in place for 2027. The folks that don't like renewable energy argued hard to get a provision in the bill that would require the PUC to study the cost that renewables add to the system by requiring they thought, additional backup reserves. The PUC produced that study. They gave it to the legislature in December. That study shows that the conclusion was there is no correlation between rising renewables and increased ancillary services.
I also read that there was a study done by the Texas Association of Business that kind
Yes.
of showed the cost of this
Yes.
somewhere like north of 5 billion. It also mentioned customers would pay more. How does that work out?
Well, anytime costs get increased in the market, you know, a lot of policymakers, legislators say, we're just going to make renewables pay more. Who do you think pays in the end? And the ERCOT CEO, Pablo Vegas, told the Senate this 2 years ago when they were considering this firming proposal. It all flows downhill. It will all get passed on to consumers. So that $5 billion, you'll pay it, right? I mean, every residential and small commercial consumer, and the big companies will find ways. Their bills will go up too, but their bills will go up less than yours because they have sophisticated energy buyers, and they'll work the system. You'll get stuck with the bill. And yes, that study showed a $5 billion cost, $6 million per average industrial customer, and $225 per residential consumer. And what is really important about this, Jenny, because I think a lot of people might say, I'd be willing to pay $225 extra if I had a reliable grid. The study also showed we would have increased likelihood of outages. So you would pay more for a less reliable grid.
That does
Great
not
deal,
sound
right?
like a good deal. Yeah, not a great deal, Doug.
What's
Let's
not to
move on.
like?
Yeah, let's move on to Senate Bill 388, requiring every new megawatt of renewable to be matched by megawatt of new gas power. What does that mean?
It means we would be tying the growth of our economy to the availability of gas turbines. Because right now, our economy is growing because we're able to build wind, solar, and storage to power economic growth. During the governor's State of the State address, he said over the last 4 years, we've increased our power supply by 35%. 90% of that increase, which is a little over 40,000 megawatts of new power, is from wind, solar, and storage. So if you start to say every megawatt of wind or solar has to be matched by a megawatt of gas, and we are right now, Jenny, in the middle of a gas turbine availability crisis. So it is very hard to get a gas turbine right now. And you can listen to NRG's, most recent, I think they actually had an investor call this morning. So maybe not their most recent. I haven't listened to it yet, but the one they did last quarter, NextEra's earnings report, and even GE Vernova, who makes the turbines, they're all saying they will not be available. If you get in line right now, if you try to go purchase a gas turbine today, you're looking at delivery in 2030, 2031, 2032. And so if you say you can't develop a megawatt of wind or solar unless you have a megawatt of gas, you're basically saying the economy can't grow unless and if gas turbines are available, which they're not. It's some of these proposals just are they're just not well thought through. It would be the most generous possible way I could put it.
And how many gas turbine projects are even in the works? There's an incentive program, and I'm not sure that's working out so well, Doug.
Well, it is and it isn't, right? I mean, there have been a lot of projects that have dropped out of that, right? 8 different projects have dropped out of the queue, and that's only in like the 8 or 9 months since they've started awarding projects. The interesting thing is by putting the Texas Energy Fund in place and providing these incentives, whether they meant it or not, because of the very thing I was just talking about, the gas turbine availability crisis, a lot of these folks have procured turbines that they otherwise might not have been able to get. So we actually may get more gas development than other places because of the Texas Energy Fund. I'm still not a fan of it, but I will always acknowledge if something works out in ways I didn't expect it to. And this is one where I think like we may end up with more gas than other places, but it's still, even if the Energy Fund is wildly successful, they're looking at 10 gigawatts of development. We have developed at this point somewhere right around 30,000 megawatts of wind and solar over the last 4 years. So in the next 4 years, if you can only get 10,000 megawatts of gas, now you're saying you can only have 10,000 megawatts of wind and solar, just as the economy's growing, temperatures are getting hotter, and data centers really want to locate here. It would be a terrible time to choke off energy development. And that's why I call it anti-energy, because at this point, we could split hairs about clean energy, dirty energy, label it this way or that. At this point, we need power on the system. And that's where we're getting it, is from wind, solar, and storage.
I know, because I think you and I had the discussion, ERCOT's projecting power demand to double by 2030, even more in 15 years. Let's touch on, speaking of wind and solar, Senate Bill 819. Now, this one restricts landowners from leasing their property to wind and solar companies. I know a lot of land and property owners in rural counties who love this bill. They do not want to live next to these projects.
Yeah. And there's also a lot of folks in rural counties that do not love these proposals. I put together a little clip on YouTube of some of the testimony at Senate Bill 819. And I was particularly struck by the testimony of a gentleman from Armstrong County, population 2,000, Schleicher County, population, I think it was like 2,500 or 3,000, Nacogdoches County, which is like 50,000, 60,000, something like that, but obviously very rural. And all these folks saying Armstrong County is a good example. Population 2,000, the wind project they have, the couple of wind projects they will deliver over the course of over the life of the projects, $50 million in landowner payments and tax payments to local governments and school districts. Again, in a county of 2,000 people. There is nothing else in Armstrong County. As the gentleman said who testified, we're dry land farmers. We don't have oil and gas. Like, there is no other thing we can do in Armstrong County to bring revenue into the county. So there's a lot of folks in rural counties that don't like it. I understand the property concerns, and I just think we need to have a more holistic conversation about that, because there's very few restrictions on oil and gas. There's all sorts of abandoned oil and gas wells all around the state that are, what are called orphaned wells, that are leaking all kinds of chemicals, creating saltwater lakes and things like that. I think that the author of that bill unfairly singled out renewable energy, which is a non-polluting resource. I know people like to say on Facebook and stuff that it's polluting. It's not. And we do have decommissioning laws that are stronger for wind and solar, and just about to be storage. They're going to pass a storage decommissioning bill here in the next couple of days. So yeah, the only other thing I'd say about 819 is if that passes again, we would end up in a situation where renewable energy development would be choked off. And we would, again, very similar to 388, would be tying the economic future of our state to the availability of gas turbines and nuclear power, which is there's just very there's very tight restrictions just from a logistical point of view as to how much of that resource can actually be developed in the next 5 years. There's not a lot of potential.
To be fair, that particular senator, I think Lois Kohorst, has heard a lot from Fayette County. They're very well organized. Maybe a small county, but those landowners are very well organized and got our ear this session, got our ear last session too. So what do you think the chances are of this passing?
Oh, I don't know what the chances of it passing. But do you know what else is in Fayette County? A great big coal plant with a big coal ash retention pond, which is leaching arsenic and selenium into their groundwater. I mean, I don't know. I would just, if I were them, I would want to look at that. And I mean, I should be careful. I don't know that it's leaching arsenic and selenium into the groundwater. I know that other coal plants have, and that eventually, if you leave them there long enough, untreated, unmitigated, that is what happens. They end up contaminating your groundwater, as the folks in Atascosa County are dealing with the San Miguel power plant. But yeah, I understand. There's a lot of folks that, don't want things developed near them, right? I mean, we deal with this all the time as a society. When a highway is built, when a pipeline cuts through somebody's land. I mean, if Texas wants to sort of start changing private property rights and giving neighbors veto authority over what somebody can do on their own land, we could do that. It would cut against what Texans have done for generations, for centuries. But it's an option, and it appears to be the way the Senate wants to go.
Okay. Finally, Senate Bill 231. This one requires electric utility companies to have mobile generators. prepared and immediately deploy after a major storm. This one came out of Hurricane Beryl, right, last year. So is this a good bill?
Oh man. Okay. So this bill actually it does come out of Hurricane Beryl, but this actually goes back to Winter Storm Uri. So the legislature passed a bill. I forget the number. I think it might have been 2438 or 2348, something like that. It was 2021. The legislature passed a bill that allowed transmission and distribution utilities. These are the companies like CenterPoint, Encore, AEP that only own poles and wires. They're poles and wires companies. Under our system, they're not supposed to own generation. This created a great big exception that said they could own generation as long as they're mobile and only deployed in an emergency. CenterPoint spent $800 million on generators that during Hurricane Beryl could not be used. They sat idle while hundreds of thousands of people were without power, many of them for a full week without power. That $800 million would have been much better spent on poles and wires. What this bill does is allow them to continue to buy generation so long as they limit it to 5 megawatts. 5 megawatts for a mobile generator is still a very large generator. That is going to be hard to move when there's a hurricane and there are trees and power lines down, right? During an ice storm where the roads are very hard to move across. What we should be doing is putting the generating sources at the site where they are needed. Where would you move that mobile generator in an emergency? A water treatment center, a nursing home, a hospital? Put the permanent generating source there. There are gas systems that Enchanted Rock sells. There are solar and storage systems that all kinds of companies, Schneider, et cetera, et cetera. So many companies sell. Generac is into solar and storage now, along with gas. There's all these companies that do this. Put them at the site so you don't have to move it there when you're trying to get around trees or ice or whatever the case may be. The transmission distribution utilities should not own generation. I am not a fan of this bill. It is a slight improvement, but it's a slight improvement on a flawed idea. That's my view on it. And $800 million were spent on. I mean, that is, even in the world of utilities where they spend a lot of money on infrastructure, $800 million on those generators was a colossal waste of money. And I think that if the legislature's takeaway from that horrible thing, which the author of Senate Bill 231 apologized to the committee for, if his takeaway is let's just make it a little less bad, I don't understand that. I think if you're heading in the wrong direction, don't just slow down. Stop the vehicle and turn around. You're going the wrong way. You don't just slow down, right? Reverse course. But apparently they're not going to do that. That bill will probably pass.
What about bills?
That one. Sorry,
what about bills you actually like, Doug? Are there any bills
there are so many? Thank you.
Oh,
I hate to be Dougie Downer. Yes.
Yeah,
there are so many good bills out there. There are good bills on transmission. There's one, House Bill 5200 that would require the PUC to look more at grid enhancing technologies. If we have any problems on the grid this week, which I don't think we will, but if we did, transmission congestion would almost certainly be a part of the problem. We have a hard time moving power where it needs to go, and grid enhancing technologies are a good and cheap way to improve the reliability of the system. That one passed the House overwhelmingly. I think it had like 130 votes or something like that. There are bills to create energy efficiency, or one of them is called the Texas Energy Waste Advisory Council, I believe is the name. Chairman King is carrying it in the House, Senator Hancock, both Republicans. In the Senate, there are also versions, the Energy Efficiency Council, carried by Vice Chair Hernandez and Senator Menendez. What this would do is actually require all the state agencies that work on energy efficiency to get together and make sure they're coordinated. Energy efficiency, I cannot emphasize enough how important that is, particularly for the winter time. We actually, if we continue to develop solar, if 388 and 715 and 819 don't pass, and we continue to develop solar at the rate we're developing it, we can actually, this is a wild thing to say. I never thought I'd say, if you asked me 10 years ago, I would have never said this kind of thing, but we can actually afford to waste a little bit of energy on the hot day. I know, because we have so much solar. We actually have an abundance. Like, it's going to be 105 this week, and we're going to have 20,000 extra megawatts. I'd rather us not waste it. I would rather us bring additional industry into the state, charge up our electric vehicles, like do all kinds of productive things with the energy. But in the wintertime, we really have no buffer to spare. And the way we heat our homes is incredibly inefficient. And summer is concerning. Winter is a little bit terrifying, because if we have another winter storm Uri, and there's nothing that, by the way, that says that there can't be something worse than Winter Storm Uri. We are, as human beings, limited, right? There's a name for this. I'm reading a book about wildfire right now, and the author of that, John Valent, talks about the Lucretius problem. Lucretius was a Roman philosopher who said, the biggest river you see is the biggest river you can imagine exists, right? But if you go to the Amazon, you realize there's a bigger river somewhere, right? So like the biggest winter storm is the only one we can imagine, but there's nothing to say it couldn't be -10 or -15 in Dallas, right? You will never have enough generation to actually deal with a problem like that unless you attack energy waste. So there's some really good bills on that. I could go on. There's all kinds of, I think the HB 14, which would incent nuclear, there are details around that I could quibble with, but I think we ought to be bringing nuclear into the state. There's bills that would support the growth of the geothermal industry in Texas. I mean, there's all kinds of good stuff out there. I just wish they would spend their time on, but unfortunately, that is not what will define this legislative session. It's the fights over bills that would make our grid less reliable and raise our costs, which continues to have me frustrated. It's a waste of everybody's time and effort.